Good to be here. And I'm talking about viruses. We've heard a lot about viruses the past 2 years with the coronavirus. So I'll do a little survey here. How many think most all viruses are bad or deleterious? Raise your hand. Several people, okay. How many think many viruses are bad or cause a problem? Raise your hand. Okay, a lot of you people. How many think that virtually all viruses are beneficial? Raise your hand. Okay, the two people who raised your hands the last time, just stand up. Go ahead, stand up. Now, I want the rest of you to see, these are the smart people. He cheated, okay, well. But that's true. The vast majority of viruses are useful, and that's what I'm going to be presenting. In fact, I originally titled this talk, When You Pray, Be Sure and Thank God for Viruses. And people said, that sounds too controversial. Well, it's not. This presentation I'm giving is pretty much the presentation you will hear if you had a microbiology course at a college or university. Okay. This is a story of a young man, Charles Templeton, who was more popular than Billy Graham. He was an evangelist in Canada. He had huge crowds, and he, in spite of his enormous success, became an atheist. Why? He wrote a whole book, Farewell to God. The two major reasons that he gave was, number one, evolution. Actually, number one was the existence of viruses and pathogenic organisms. His question was, if there was a good God, why would he create viruses and pathogenic organisms? Why would a good God create these things? That was his question. And he made it very clear, how could there be a God when in the world there are viruses everywhere? Now I will give you, and I was surprised, I couldn't believe I saw this. This is in the National Geographic, and we know if the National Geographic says something, it's true. Right? Well, in this case, it is true. And it says there very clearly, they kill us by the millions, but without them, life is impossible. National Geographic. Without viruses, life would be impossible. And when we talk about the death rate of viruses, what harm they cause, and of course they certainly do, and this is a chart which Heinz sent to me, and what he looked at here is the number of people who have died as a result of various viruses. So no question, many people die as a result of viruses. And a couple of books, many others, but the one, Coronavirus in Christ, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And so these books are asking the same question. How in the world could there be a good God when he created viruses? Well, the rest of this presentation, I will basically talk about how important viruses are. And again, if there wasn't viruses, you wouldn't be here. None of you would be here. That's how important they are. And of course, National Geographic said that, so it's got to be true. I'm being facetious. Charles Darwin. Why did God make viruses? Based on the false idea that most all viruses cause disease. That is the question people ask. And Charles Darwin, of course, asked the same question. In fact, one of the main arguments he used against God was, why would there be a world with such things like viruses? He didn't use that term, but that's basically what he looked at. Okay, what are viruses? Viruses are actually gene machines. Gene machines. They have many roles they play, and in my area, in microbiology and in biochemistry, when I worked at the medical school in the Department of Pathology, trying to understand things like disease, etc., we have used the workhorse of molecular biology is viruses. Viruses have a very important role to play, and that is they can bring genes into your body and cause all kinds of cures, problems as well, but of course we focus on cures. And so they play many critical roles, and one thing they do is they are used as a major tool in biochemistry to bring genes inside of your genome. What else do they do? Well, a lot of viruses, we don't know what they do. Why? Because when you get money to do research, you have to have a good reason. And if I knocked on your door and said, well, I'm raising money to do research on viruses, they might say, a coronavirus? No, not the coronavirus. Well, what viruses are you researching? Well, there are 5 viruses in your eye, and we want to understand what they do. And they might ask, well, do they cause disease? Well, no. Do they cause a problem? Well, no. Well, what do you want to learn what they do for? Just curiosity. Probably, if you were the person at the door, you probably would say, look, I want to give my money to cure cancer, to do things that are useful. I don't want to spend all my money to satisfy your curiosity. No thanks. They don't cause a problem, then why research them? And that is the problem we have, because most viruses don't cause a problem. In your body are trillions of viruses, all doing their job without a nary of complaint. We're not even aware they're there. And I'll give you an idea how many there are in a few minutes. That is a virus, you can see. And what are they made out of? They're made out of a coat, a jacket, if you will, some DNA, a few proteins, and some spikes. The spike protein we're very aware of. The spike protein is kind of like identification. When I flew the airplane to get here, I had to show identification. Well, viruses have identification, so the body knows what they are, if they're good or bad. And of course, vast majority are good, so therefore the body will say, okay, come on in, you're doing fine, no problem. Welcome. And so the identification tag is important, and I'll mention more about that in a minute. Now, here are some types of viruses. There are many kinds. And one thing you notice about them is that they are, well, looks like they are designed. They almost look like Christmas tree ornaments. They don't look like just a bunch of stuff. They look like they're, well, designed. And I will focus on one which I think is probably the best example. And I'll focus on that in a minute. So, they're gene machines. They have a protein capsule. They're covered with markers for identification. That's called the antigen. That's the spikes we know about in the spike proteins. And they, inside, they have a genetic code. And the interesting thing is that their gene system is compatible with ours. That means they can get in your cell, they can take over your cellular machinery, they can use your cellular machinery to make more viruses, to make proteins, or whatever. They fit right in there. Like a wrench that fits the bolt perfectly. And therefore viruses are designed to utilize your basic cellular machinery. Because viruses don't have any of that. Their DNA and a few proteins, they can't really do anything. They can just sit around. They cannot make other viruses. They have to use your body to make other viruses or whatever else they want to make. So what were they designed for? Well, as I mentioned, they were designed to be the workhorse of molecular biology. And if you think about it, they're just perfectly designed to do what we did in the lab I was working in the area of molecular biology. And we use genetically modified viruses to do all kinds of things, to carry foreign DNA into many different cell kinds. And there are a number of diseases which we have been able to cure through the use of viruses. In fact, as far as I remember, that's about all we worked with was viruses. That was every day. Interesting, you have a Eppendorf tube. You walk around, it looks like there's clear water in there, and there's viruses, of course, can't see them, and every now and then you walk around, and it is clear water. There's no viruses in there. So you got to check them occasionally and make sure you still have the viruses that you're working with. You modify not only, of course, people, animals, and plants. All life you can modify using viruses. And when they talk about genetic recombinant DNA, etc., most cases they're using viruses to get that recombination. Gene therapy, of course, probably that's, and of course genetically modified foods. We could have a whole presentation on this, genetically modified foods, but the fact is that a lot of foods we work with and a lot of therapies that we're using today are only possible because of viruses. Now we'll talk about bacteriophages, and they are by far the most interesting of all viruses. And there you can see some details of several kinds of viruses. And the one at the bottom corner, you can see it looks like a rocket ship. And that is the bacteriophage. And there you can see more details. And I have a friend, very bright woman, and she doesn't believe viruses exist. They don't exist. And I have a hard time convincing her they do. And you can see them through electron microscopes. You can see them. And you can see in the middle here a picture of one of these bacteriophages looking through an electron microscope. It's there. You can see it. In fact, we have not only seen it, we've got all the details measured. The length of different parts, what they do, how it works. We know a lot about that virus. And one of the most interesting things from this was there was a man by the name of Michael Behe who was studying this and saw that virus and said, it's designed. It was designed. Designed. Huh. And he came up with the research, which eventually, of course, he ended up writing books about irreducible design, irreducible complexity, because he realized that if you take a few of those parts away, that thing's not going to work. It's not going to survive. It has to have all those parts. And so these viruses are irreducibly complex, and of course, he revolutionized biology by helping us understand that that was the case. And there you can see on a bacteria, you can see this poor bacteria is surrounded by bacteriophages. And that gives you an idea how small they are. They're really quite tiny. And that poor bacteria, he's finished. In fact, that's one important function of bacteriophages is they keep the bacteria infection down in our body. In fact, that is one treatment. Instead of antibiotics, that is one treatment for bacteria infections is bacteriophages. And there, in case you're curious, there's all the details. The top part here, it's 65 nanometers. The DNA you can see is in the head there. You got the sheath. You got basically all the measurements. So we know details of how that thing is constructed. And in case you're curious further, we have the DNA. You can see in a loop here, we draw it. And we have all of the parts of the DNA and what they do. And Lambda virus is one that we use in the medical school. I think this is Lambda virus. Lambda virus is a virus which has a lot of room. So we can take out a lot of stuff and not destroy the virus and put in the DNA we want to get inside some plant or get inside some animal. And so Lambda virus is the workhorse, specifically the workhorse of a lot of DNA research. And so I find it intriguing that we not only know they exist, we know what all of the DNA inside that virus does. Got it all figured out. Okay, before antibodies were developed, of course, antibiotics were developed, much of the research was on bacteriophages. In fact, I understand that now they are still used in Russia, Ukraine, and certain other countries, that bacteriophages is the appropriate treatment for certain bacteria infections. And so in the future, if you're can no longer take any antibiotic, the doctor might say, well, I'll give you a prescription for bacteriophages. And you take that, you get them in your body, and then they'll deal with the bacteria infection. In fact, they actually do a good job on that. Russia, Georgia, and Poland 3 countries that use this approach. Still use it today. And we can see if you have an allergic reaction to an antibiotic, well, try this method. As far as I know, though, it's not tried routinely in this country, but some people go to other countries to utilize that therapy. In fact, there's interest in bringing the phage approach back to this country so that we can utilize the advantages of this approach. Now, you might say, doesn't this hurt the body? No, this does not at all in any way, shape, or form hurt your body. As far as we know from research, it has no adverse effect on your body, period. None, absolutely none. They're totally safe. In fact, right now in your body are trillions of them, and I guess you feel okay, in spite of those trillions floating around and doing their hard work. Viruses are also at the base of the marine food chain, which means that you start out with viruses, and viruses is the meal for many, many organisms. Smaller at first, but then we end up with this chain, and the larger eats the smaller until we end up with big fish, carp, and so on. And so in the sea, we find a glass of water, seawater, just take a glass from the sea or from the lakes, and there's about 150 million viruses in that glass of water. Okay? And the large part of the diet of many sea animals is viruses. So they're an important food source. So if you like to fish, there you go. Keep that in mind. The major problem in health is mutated viruses, and that is the major problem with bacteria as well. The coronavirus is a good example. Coronavirus normally does its job, doesn't cause a problem, but it's mutated, and therefore it causes a problem. We're back to the problem of mutations again. And as you probably know if you study evolution, evolutionists claim the major source of genetic variety that produced you and me, dogs, cats, and all life is viruses. Okay? And mutations of those viruses. And mutations of bacteria. And mutations of your cells, which produce you. So therefore, mutations are doing good and doing bad in some ways. And I'll try to summarize the importance of mutations in evolution. Namely, evolutionists say you are the result of billions of mistakes caused by mutations. So look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, you're the result of billions of mistakes. And when I have the kids do this, they love it. And they'll say, in your case, it's really true. But if you think about it, it's ludicrous to conclude that you and animals and plants are the result of billions of mistakes. It's ludicrous. I made some mistakes in my life, but I can't remember one that is really beneficial. There might be. It's like, let's say I drove here, and the GPS said, turn left at this street, so I turn right. It says then, drive straight for 4 miles. And I just make a U-turn, drive the other way. And so every direction it gives me, I change it. And then I got here in record time. Does that make sense? No, obviously. If you don't follow the directions, you're probably not going to make it in record time. You probably won't make it early. You'll probably make it late. Okay? So, because we know about 99% of all mutations are deleterious or near neutral. Near neutral means they're not lethal, but they add up. It's kind of like in our bodies. We have viruses in our bodies, and it causes aging. Eventually, we have more and more mutations, and eventually we die. So, in our body, viruses eventually cause death. I was just reading a book on the airport here, and it mentioned that everybody, if you live long enough, everybody dies of cancer. Everybody dies of cancer. Now, a heart attack may get you first. You may live to be 105, But eventually, if you live long enough, viruses will kill you. Now, I've got the word virus. I can't get out of my mind. Eventually, mutations will kill you. Okay? And so it brings out, and that's interesting in this book I was reading, because the book was basically lauding evolution. And it's interesting that he admits that viruses eventually will kill us. They are invariably almost all harmful, but yet this man believes that you are the result, and all life is the result of billions of mistakes caused by mutations. And as I read it, I'm wondering, wait a minute. The man is clearly an evolutionist. In fact, he wrote that book I'm reading against creationists. He's clearly an evolutionist, and yet he makes our main argument, and that is there is no source of genetic variety except mutations, and that's not going to work because the vast majority are harmful or worse or near neutral. And near neutral, I should mention, try to reiterate, near neutral means that they don't kill you separately, but they add up. And that, of course, causes aging. So it causes aging. So thank God for viruses. I mentioned the Lambda virus. It's spelled out here. You can see what the word looks like. And they offer potentials, promising potentials to cure cancer, correct genetic disorders, fight pathogenic viral infections, and we use viruses in many genetic studies to understand molecular mechanisms. It's kind of a summary of how important they are. And a few other uses. They're used as insecticides. They're used to facilitate drought tolerance in some plants. Virologists strive for good reason to downplay the bad. If you're a virologist, people say, well, all you do is work with these bad things. Viruses have a bad reputation, and virologists realize this. They've got a bad rep, and so a lot of virologists want to basically say, no, they are very harmful. The vast majority are very, did I say harmful? See, it's affecting me. They're very helpful, very useful, and therefore we study viruses because they can be used for good things, beneficial things. So they're aware that it's got a bad rep. And that was the purpose of that article in National Geographic, to show indeed that viruses are very important for life. Endogenous retroviruses, these, what do they do? Well, among other things, they regulate the expression of genes to fine-tune species-specific transcriptomes in mammals. In other words, they help control volume. They turn things up, they turn things down. Endogenous retroviruses are inherent part of mammalian biology, which dramatically influences gene expression. And that's a big concept. In other words, they basically turn things up or down. How do they know? Well, we're trying to figure that out. How do they know what to turn up or turn down or ignore? We're trying to work on that. But the discovery that they regulate genetic expression is quite a revelation and quite important to understanding what they do. I have a feeling if this whole system of things is around for 20, 30, 40 years, we may have whole courses on all the good things that viruses do that now we're just beginning to understand. Coronavirus, of course, that's one of the most infamous now. And it is a multifunctional molecular machine that mediates the coronavirus's entry into the host cell. And first it has to bind to a receptor, and it can't get in without binding to a receptor, and there you can see is the coronavirus. And there you can see is the antibodies which are attacking the coronavirus, and they attack the coronavirus by matching with the identification on those spikes. That's how they match. Now, I thought I had another slide, I guess. Okay, this is the one I was looking for. Before viruses, they can't just get in anybody. Before they can get into your body, they have to have the right keys. and this is HIV, the best example. They have to have 2 keys to get into your cells, T cells in this case. They have to have 2 keys. And therefore, they are obviously, this HIV-1 is designed to enter certain cells because it has to have the keys, and therefore it doesn't get into any other cell. And to get into this cell here, the T cell, it has to have both keys. One key's missing, can't get in. And that's a good example because there are people who have a damaged CCR5 receptor. That's a co-receptor. That's damaged. And when that's damaged, guess what? They cannot get infected with HIV. And there are a few people out there, and they wonder, gee, I worked in a situation where I was exposed over and over and over to HIV. I never got infected. In fact, there are a number of people, one case in particular, he was a homosexual couple. His partner died of AIDS. They tested him, and he was okay. Got another partner who also died of AIDS. They tested him, he was okay. Got a third partner also died of AIDS. And he was wondering, boy, God up there really must love me or something. Because my 3 former partners all died of AIDS, and I'm doing fine. And so they did research, and they found in this case, and there's, I think, like 1 or 2% of all cases, people have a defective CCR5 receptor, and therefore they cannot get AIDS. And that's intriguing because viruses cannot get into your cells unless they have the right key to get in. It's back to the intelligent design idea. They're designed to be compatible, and I can get into your house if I have your key. If I don't have your key, I can't get in. I probably shouldn't get in. If you give me your key, then I know, well, it's okay to get into your house. That's why you gave me the key. And likewise, if it has a key, it can get into the cells. Only the cells it's supposed to get into. And that's why HIV cannot get into any other cells aside from T cells. As far as I know, that's the only cell they can get into. And there we can see the HIV is trying to get into the cell, T cell in this case, and doesn't have both receptors. The cell doesn't have both receptors, so it can't get in. Now, coronavirus, of course, which is all of the press, and one thing that concerns me and all virologists, I'm not a virologist, but it concerns my friends who are virologists, is that we are going to end up being so clean, etc., we're not going to develop the proper response to viruses. And the book I was just reading today, by the way, it mentions that when we're in a womb, in our mother's womb, basically our body sheds by a certain mechanism protein. And the immune system, if it attacks that protein, that immune response is destroyed. And therefore that immune response cannot produce any more clones, any more copies. So in other words, basically when you're developing, your body cuts pieces of your protein, puts them out in the body, and the body, if it attacks it, then we prevent that clone from making copies. If it doesn't attack it, then that means self, and you're okay. It's amazing. Now, what happens when you're born? When you're born, the same thing happens, that your body learns what are good and bad, and if they respond appropriately, your body ignores it. So your body has to figure out what's going on, and if it responds when it shouldn't, then that cell family that produces that particular response is destroyed. In other words, to kind of cut to the chase, I'll give you an example first which illustrates that. We had a nurse. Nurses sometimes tend to be very conscious of bacteria for good reason. But a nurse that we worked with, she had a child, and she autoclaved the child's clothing and blankets and sheets. Autoclaved it. Don't ask me where she got the autoclave. I don't know. I don't have any idea. That basically she sterilized all the bed sheets and all the clothing. So this child was reared in a germ-free world and then started school. And you know what happened. Anybody, what happened? She what? got sick and died. Child died. Didn't have the proper immune response. So when a child, your kids, they don't walk around mud puddles, they walk in them. They play in mud. What's so attractive about mud? Well, they play in mud, they get dirty. I mean, that's what kids do. And that turns out to be really, really healthy because their body then learns the proper response and the problematic pathogens it develops a defense against. And then when they're exposed to those problematic pathogens, your body can just wipe them out. It takes a while because you have these childhood diseases. So the first, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years, most kids get sick a lot. Well, their body's still trying to figure out the good and the bad, what's harmful and what's not harmful. And that exposure is necessary. So if you keep your child in a sterile environment, good luck. They need to get out there and get dirty, which most children do. Have you ever had a child who just was scrupulously clean and would never, always ignore the mud puddles and just went out and played and came back in 2 hours later and didn't have a spot on his clothes? So that's a problem. And they think with peanut allergies, etc., they think the problem is that we're not exposed to these things when we're really young, and we haven't been able to learn that these are not a problem, and therefore, okay, no problem. And so we're not exposed to peanuts until we're in 3rd grade. Then our body misinterprets them and thinks it's a problem, and then we have a horrible autoimmune response, which causes them to get really sick. And so let your kids, I guess I played in mud when I was a kid. We had a sandbox, and that's kind of muddy and dirty, but not quite as muddy and dirty as mud. And so we played in sandbox. And so that's one way of exposing your kids to bacteria. So if you put your children in an environment where they're not exposed to these things, problem. And now we wear masks, we have these plexiglass covers wherever we go and buy something. We've got this glass. When I got my ticket, there was, of course, this glass there, and I had plexiglass. I had to talk around it to give them the information for my ticket. And so I'm thinking we may not get the proper exposure we need to viruses and bacteria, and it may end up doing harm. Now, it cuts back the common cold. That's good. No problem. But on the other hand, we need the exposure, especially when we're young, so our body, the immune system, can mature. And if it doesn't mature, we may end up like this child did, going to school, and after 2, 3, 4 months, was dead. Body could not handle the bacteria and the viruses because of the mother autoclaving the clothing, and was very, very clean. When I worked in Arlington Psychological Associates, I got my license and was a therapist. My most memorable clients were the germ nuts. That's not the proper term. I don't use that term in front of them. They're microphobiacs. But I could go into long lectures of the germ nuts and how it really ruins their lives in so many ways because they're so concerned about germs. They're ultra clean. And that is a problem. It is a problem. So coronaviruses, and this data is a little bit outdated, 7.3 million, deaths 208,000, worldwide case about 34 million, recovered about 23 million, and deaths about 1.2 million. This data is outdated, but nonetheless, it gets you an idea of what's going on. H1N1, 60 million cases worldwide, about 12,000 deaths, 274,000 hospitalizations. So it is a problem. What is the solution? Well, when I have a master's in public health, and I studied epidemiology, and what they taught us was, if you're young and healthy, you need exposure so you develop proper resistance. They call that herd immunity. And usually about 70% of herd immunity causes the virus to not be able to spread. Because to spread, it's got to get in my body, use my cells to make more copies of the virus, and then those copies spread out. And that's the problem. And it appears, there's lots of debate about this, of course, but just my my fallible opinion. I know most people think their opinion's infallible in this area, but nonetheless, it seems like we did it all wrong, and my perception is if we would have done it according to what they said in my epidemiology course, we would have had the coronavirus here and gone within 6 months, been over. And we just lengthened the inevitable. So it seems to me what happened. So many people got it and never really had any problematic symptoms. They were largely symptom-free, but they then produce part of the herd immunity, which ends up causing the virus to die off. And now I think we have a lot of germ nuts walking around that are fearful about bacteria and viruses and are going to extremes which may, in the future, cause more problems. I don't know if we have question and answer time. That might be something you could ask about. But yeah. Now, I like controversial questions.
All right, so we have a few minutes to be able to do some question and answers. Dr. Bergman is allowing that. So we want to put the mic on you. I know a lot of people are uncomfortable about the mic, but we're webcasting these and we'll be recording these, so please let me bring the mic to you. Try to keep your... this is a call for questions, not comments. Okay, so keep your to a question if you can. And if anyone for a question for Dr. Bergman, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone back. We have some time.
You may not know the answer to this, but I was wondering why they stopped using the phages completely in the United States.
It just became out of style. We had antibiotics, so why not? The idea they're going to inject some live bacteria or in this case viruses, in your body is just not very appealing. So the antibiotics seemed more modern, more technical, but that's a good question because for many people who are allergic, I'm allergic to tetracycline. I can't take any tetracycline. I'm allergic to it because they gave it to me for minor reasons, and they shouldn't have done that. We clearly way overuse antibiotics, and that's caused a lot of problems because there are people out there, especially people who have AIDS involved in the homosexual lifestyle, they are allergic to all the family of antibiotics. They can't take any of them. So with those, they have no really choice except taking phage. I think we're really not aware of that so much in this country. We're not something that we are aware of. So, and as far as I know, there's no companies that sell them in this country. So you have to go to Poland or some other country. But that's a very good question.
So is there a relationship between vaccines and phages?
I'm not sure of. The idea of a vaccine is it's like a fake invasion. And you have the invaders that look like the real thing. They have the guns, but the guns don't fire. And therefore, your immune system doesn't know they're fake, but responds appropriately. Then when the real guys come in, the actual virus or bacteria, then the immune system is built up so it can respond to it. So basically, vaccines work by different ways. A common way is to attenuate the actual bacteria or virus. So the virus is real, it's there, it's living, but you take out the genes that cause the problem. So they come in your body for various reasons after this, and then your body can fight it because what comes in your body is the real thing. The stuff that's injected in the vaccine is the real thing, but it's attenuated, it can't cause a problem. So that's essentially how it works. And the same, now they have other means as well. But the idea is you're trying to trigger the immune system to respond to that specific pathogen.
So I got one more question. You said there are trillions of viruses in our bodies. Mm-hmm. Is that trillions of different viruses?
A lot of the same, but I don't know how many different kinds there are. Again, this is something that's not known because who cares? As long as they're doing their job. Now, the ones that cause a problem, we need to learn what they are, and we need to care about those. But the vast majority doesn't care. I just know there are 5 in the eye, and I thought that it's intriguing. And I've asked a number of people, what do they do? And I don't know. But they're there. I understand they're consistently there. None of you have an eye without those viruses. So they probably have some role, but I'm just intrigued as to what they could do. What do they do? I don't know. Nobody knows. If you find out, let me know.
So I have another question. So all viruses need a host, correct?
Right. They cannot reproduce. They have to get into your cells. They cannot reproduce outside of your cells. The only way, that's why they're not really living. We say you kill a virus. You can't kill a virus because it's not living. Living, you're talking about things that can reproduce. They can't reproduce. They just sit there. And as far as we know, they can sit there for generations and then infect someone and then cause a problem.
And then you said they're also in plants?
Oh, yeah, lots of viruses infect plants as well. Yeah, and so they...
I'm fascinated by what you said about viruses being food for the marine food chain. Do you mind expanding on that a little bit? I have never heard that before, and that's so... Do other things use viruses for food?
Well, we know the food chain does because plankton, a major source of food, is viruses. And of course, plankton is a major source of food for lots of critters, including whales, ironically. And so therefore, it's the lowest rung in the food chain. And therefore, if you didn't have that lowest rung, I don't know, you wouldn't have a food chain and you probably wouldn't have life in the ocean. And so therefore, we know they're important for that reason. As you study biology, you realize that there's a very important reason for everything. And that's especially true with the body. And we need to realize that is true with viruses and bacteria as well.
If the viruses cannot reproduce on their own, how are they making 120 million in a glass of water? I mean, a seawater. I'm just kind of wondering where is that coming from? Because if they have to be in a living something else to reproduce, do they know how that's happening?
Oh yeah, they infect other creatures, and then they make zillions of viruses, and then...
So other plankton, they infect a plankton
Yeah,
and then
I'm not sure, but
reproduce?
it's plankton, but yeah, they do infect other creatures and make lots of copies, and then the copies are spread out, and then they become a food source. So next time you have a fish sandwich, then wonder how many viruses are in there that are still, hate to use the word living, but how many viruses are in there that are still viable.
Last call for question. Dr. Bergman, as someone with a background in molecular biology myself, I grew up in the church, and so I never really believed in evolution. And I've known about viruses, and I've always taken the position that everything God made has a purpose, and that viruses clearly have a purpose. They make us sick, because of their they're copying themselves so many times that they make us sick. So they seem to make us sick, but if it's what you said is true, very intriguing that they alter gene expression in the host organism. They're playing a role. It seems to be a genetic shuttle, like to shuttle genetic information between one species and another. And if they affect if they're altering gene expression too, then clearly there's a significant role that these things are playing in our body, right? Yeah. So I'm now worrying, as a person who's always taken a flu shot. I always got my flu shots every single year. Well, what we're doing by getting those flu shots is preparing our immunity system to fight the things off before they even have a chance to do their job. And so now I'm wondering, have I been making a mistake of always taking these flu shots to keep it from getting me sick or making me uncomfortable, preventing itself from doing its job that it was really made to do? I don't know. This is...
Yeah,
right?
well. And again, the viruses that cause a problem, and there are very few that cause a problem, but those viruses are mutated of the ordinary ones, of the ones that are doing a good job.
It looks like there's a question online. Okay. Can you address the endogenous retrovirus issue regarding chimps and humans? An online question.
In what? Endogenous?
Can you address the endogenous retrovirus issue regarding chimps and humans?
Okay, and I should mention retroviruses. Normally, viruses, they have either DNA or RNA, okay? The master blueprint is DNA. Well, some, actually, the master blueprint is RNA. So they have to go from RNA to DNA, and then the DNA does what DNA does. So the retrovirus means that they have to have reverse transcriptase, which converts the mRNA, which is the master blueprint for the virus, to RNA. And of course, the most famous example is AIDS. AIDS is the viral master blueprint is RNA. And that is unique in a sense because you can kill it by affecting the reverse transcriptase, and therefore it can't make DNA, and therefore it can't do the problems it does. But now we use reverse transcriptase a lot in genetic research because we may want to take, well, one way of doing it is the DNA makes RNA, and then we take out all the stuff we don't need in the RNA, the mRNA, the messenger RNA. So we get messenger RNA, we take all the stuff we don't need, because we can work with that, so we cut it down so we have just the cells, the parts that we need, the sections we need. And then we use reverse transcriptase to make DNA, and then we can put the DNA inside of other cells to do the job. So it's a very important way of basically toning down, because there's so much information in the genome, we want to get rid of a lot of it because it just takes room and space and doesn't help often, so we want to get just what we need, and that's how we do it by retroviruses. Endogenous means basically that is where that is the major storage of the DNA information, which is in mRNA or RNA. And then you have double-stranded, single-stranded, and so on. So there's a lot of variations in a virus. Double-stranded means you have 2 DNAs, 2 RNAs. And then single-stranded means you have 1, which is the master, and 1 RNA, which is the master. So hopefully I'm not going over your head. But
he mentioned an endogenous retroviruses between chimps and humans.
Yeah, because it seems that a lot of these, the home, it has to have a host that it doesn't kill. If it's like every now and then when I worked for the court, we had some ne'er-do-well son moved in, the parents killed the parents. Then he died because he had no one to take care of him. Okay, he had problems. And so in essence, if the virus kills the host, it cannot survive. So you want the host to survive, and therefore most viruses, the home, and for the endogenous retrovirus, the home is certain primates, chimps, monkeys. And therefore it can survive in there. That's the host, that's where it lives. And then when it goes from them to us, that causes the problem. Because we're also primates and they also can infect us. And so therefore they have to have all viruses have a host organism, a host where they can live and reproduce and not kill the host. They kill the host, and that's a problem. They think that's what's going on with some of the coronavirus now, where the virus kills the host, you kill off the stronger ones, you leave the weaker ones. And so now more of the coronaviruses are the weaker ones, which don't kill the host. And so that they say they're evolving, but they're not evolving in the sense of evolution from from cells to humans. They're basically, the number of viruses that are problematic are less common because they kill the host. And so now they think the coronavirus, the one that caused the problem, will be with us forever, but it won't cause a problem because we'll get infected, we'll get sick for 2 or 3 days maybe have a cold-like symptoms, and then no problem beyond that point. So they become milder as time goes by for the simple reason, once they kill the host, they have no more, they die themselves. And so that's why they become milder. They use so often the term evolution, and we're really not talking about evolution. We're talking about viruses. There is variety, and some can do certain things, and therefore they're selected. Others can't, and therefore they're not selected. So that's not an issue. The problem is, how do we get bacteria from nothing, or from the first cells? How do we get life from lower forms of life? Not how we get one strain of virus into another strain. That's not what we're concerned about. That's well recognized, and that's not evolution. Hopefully I answered the question.
So yeah, I've got another question. You mentioned a couple of times herd immunity and developing immunity in children. And then you said that the coronavirus should have been or could have been pretty much eliminated within 6 months, whereas we survived it for 2 years. What should have been done differently on the coronavirus?
Well, those who are at risk, namely who have several comorbidities, should be really carefully protected. Let the rest of the population get it,
Okay.
especially the young people.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say this in front of an audience here, but when a young person would get it, I'd say, good, one step closer toward herd immunity. And a lot of young people have gotten it, and rarely do they have any symptoms. So I think to protect all these young kids against the coronavirus, I wonder what for? And now we know all of the problematic results of wearing masks all day, you can't socialize normally, keeping kids home from school, et cetera, et cetera. Now it becomes clearer and clearer that all we tried to do, especially, quote, protecting kids, has done more harm than good. Suicide rate's gone up, and kids now are social, and depression's gone up, and a lot of problems that developed did not need to develop. And so from day one, you got to be careful mentioning this because I might be wrong, but what I learned in school from day one is you let the kids get it. And let them get sick and help them get better, and then we'll move on. Now, of course, they can come home and give the kids, or the parents, the problem. Just keep the kids who are sick away from grandparents. But I know so many people in their 80s that got it and had no problems, that had comorbidities. But evidently you have to have several comorbidities before it becomes a problem. And now we also know how better to treat it. I understand, again, I'm not a medical doctor, so just take this with a grain of salt, but I understand that once you put them on a ventilator, they're probably not going to live. It's probably not the best treatment, is put them on a ventilator. And so you can check with your family doctor before you but go ahead.
Excuse me, Dr. Bergman. The question from the person online, this is Mark Champney's, he's following up and trying to clarify what his original question was. So he says, evolutionists claim that endogenous retroviruses infected an ancestor of chimps and humans. Why do they match currently in chimps and humans? I don't know.
Well, they live in the chimps, okay, and then they don't normally pass from chimps to humans. And so therefore, the theory is, relative to AIDS especially, the theory is that a human either was bitten by a chimp, okay, or consumed a chimp, or had sexual relations with a chimp. Those are the three theories. And those are the theories of how they were passed on from chimps to humans. Which one is true, I don't know. I've heard all three theories. People advocate for one or the other. And so therefore, I think that's a concern. They're not normally part of our environment. We do not deal very well with the HIV virus, whereas chimps, it's a normal part of their environment. And some other mammals like bats, you have some other viruses which also cause a problem. But normally, again, they're not passed from one to the other unless there is a direct contact in some way. And the contact usually has to be more than just touching the chimp. It has to be biting, consuming the chimp, or sexual relations with the chimp to pass it on to somebody else. From what's known. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
When the 1919 flu came back around, my mom's doctor tested her and said that she did not need to have any kind of a shot for it because she was still immune from it, and she lived to be 103 and a half. And so if somebody's had the virus, how long do you think that they're protected? Is it a lifetime protection?
We don't know. We used to think that tetanus, for example, you were immune for life. Now they say, to be sure, after 10 years, let's get a booster shot for tetanus. You are immune for life, but depends on the person, and it also depends upon the virus and the bacteria. A lot of times, the pandemic comes and goes, the problem comes and goes, and it's not spread, and so therefore, whether we have immunity or not is irrelevant. And so that's, but something that you could be exposed to in the future, like tetanus, after 10 years, get a tetanus shot. just to be safe and not sorry. So any other? Well, it's a good audience. You must have some really bright people here. Did you have to have an IQ test to get in here? Is that what you gave an IQ test before they could come in? But there's some very good questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not quite familiar with viruses. I've never studied them, but you mentioned something about viruses not being a living thing, perhaps. So my question is, an individual virus, does it actually cease to exist, or does it just become dormant?
Yeah, a lot can become dormant, that's true, because as far as we know, they can exist for centuries. The concern is when we dug up the mummies in Egypt, that some people got virus infections they would have never gotten if they didn't do that. And so the feeling is that some of those can, but again, they're not living, they're not reproducing, they just sit there. But on the other hand, with cosmic radiations, which can break up the parts and therefore disable them so they cannot infect any other organism. And they think the ones in the pyramids were protected from cosmic radiations, and that's why they caused a problem.
And how do they multiply then?
They multiply by getting into your cells. That's the only way they can multiply. They have to take over your cellular machinery, and they use your cellular machinery to produce new copies of the virus. So your cell actually produces the new virus as a result of the directions of the DNA using your cellular machinery, because they don't have all the equipment. They don't have reverse transcriptase. Many of them don't. They don't have the equipment they need. They don't have polymerase. They don't have the things that are necessary in order to produce, most of them don't, in order to produce copies of themselves. So that's a good question. Lord, we thank you much for this day. We thank you for this audience. We thank you for their enthusiasm. We thank you for their wanting to understand more of your word and applying it to their lives. We especially thank you for the creation of us and the world around us. You've created a wonderful world that gives unequivocal testimony to you as the creator, the loving creator that did so much for us. Amen.